So why don't we start by introducing ourselves? I'm Martin Leahy. I've been with Chicago School for about 10 years, and research methods is mostly what I teach and what I love to teach.
And I'm Liz Schwab. I think I've been with the Chicago School since 2011. Started teaching in one of the master's programs here while I was still a student. And work with many students on different research designs.
And I'm Dr. Marlon Sukel. I've been with the Chicago School since 2010, and I primarily teach the research methods course, PB 455.
It's probably helpful for you to know at the beginning of the process that my orientation is to interpretive research, qualitative research. I'm not especially good at quantitative. Dr. Sukel?
Well, I dabble in both. I started as a statistics professor, so definitely quantitative as per the training I received in my program. But for my dissertation, I really learned qualitative methods. So now I essentially teach both, and I love both. So happy to talk on both sides.
And my orientation is primarily quantitative, though I've begun dabbling in qualitative and started to expand my knowledge as well, engaging in training opportunities and workshops.
That's great. So let's spend a moment on why we wanted to do this short video and why we think it's important. One of the things that I find is that students often get lost in the weeds, and it's helpful for them to have a tool where they can see the big picture. This might be my orientation also, because I like to view the world from 30,000 feet. That's not the way everybody views it. But this tool allows you to go deep and pull back. Your orientation might be more towards details. To also understand that the research process has generic steps that are applicable regardless of the methodology. The chart that we're about to show you will also identify the design decisions you need to make. And finally, we're hoping that you'll have a sense that research is iterative. You'll do something, you'll go back and do it again, you'll go back and do it again. Somebody once talked about kneading bread or making challah. You know, at some point when you knead the dough enough, it all comes together. But they're flipping it over and kneading it, flipping it over and kneading it. And I think that's a good metaphor for how you design research. So Dr. Sukel.
Yes, so this research design process is something we teach in our PB 455 class. As I mentioned earlier, that's the class I teach on a regular basis. And each one of these aspects is so important to research. So I want us to have a conversation in regards to each one of these. So why don't we start with what problem or opportunities interest me? And thinking about this in terms of our previous research as far back as our dissertations, perhaps we can engage in a discussion starting with how you discovered your problem, or how that was brought to you, or perhaps something you were thinking about in terms of research when you entered your program. Any thoughts?
Well, I'm happy to start. I had sort of an odd inspiration point for my research, which was that I was broadly interested in how and why people made the decisions that they did. And this, of course, came because I was very interested in true crime, but did not want to go into forensic psychology or study necessarily the criminal mind. But I did want to know more about how people made decisions. And so I started from a very broad level and began sort of narrowing in my topic from there.
Thank you, Dr. Leahy.
Yeah, I can jump in and say that when I started my doctoral program, I had at that point 15 years of consulting experience and a bachelor's degree. And so I thought, why don't I go to school and get some theoretical basis for what I've been doing for 15 years. My initial interest was, is it possible to make business organizations more hospitable to human beings? Is it possible for organizations to reach their margins, but also live in a way that's true to their mission and values. And initially, my interest when I went into my dissertation research was spirituality at work. And I was really interested in how do people bring all of themselves to work.
It's really interesting. I would say same thing here. I think really starting with the social impact of my research, I really wanted to explore flexible and telework opportunities in organizations, which at the time were not very pervasive in organizations as we see now with COVID-19 as an example, and the need to do that. But I really wanted to study both work and family outcomes when having the opportunity to look at alternative work arrangements. And so really looking at the social impact there, which consequently and ironically has come to fruition now that we're seeing most of the country and employees are working remotely. So certainly the practical problem there. Wonderful. Let's transition into how you made that shift from a practical problem into a research problem, which many students talk about in my classes. Many of them are practitioners working in the field, and they really have their practitioner hat on. And one of the conversations I have with them is, well, take your practitioner hat on, let's put on your scholarly hat. And so how do you transfer that practical problem into a research problem in this case? So any thoughts there on how you made that paradigm shift?
Yeah, for me, it was discovering social psychology and behavioral economics. It began to give me a window into that there were researchers looking at how people made decisions. And the primary interest for me was what are the influences that are out there impacting how we make decisions. And so social psychology and behavioral economics started to give me that overview, that introduction to it. And that was when I began to get into what the research problem was. I was reading a lot about influence, about persuasive cues, and how certain types of information could influence and impact how we make decisions.
Great, Dr. Lee.
Yeah, so for me, what happened was I connected with 3, 4, 5 other students, and we spoke regularly about our research interests. And ultimately, it would be a group of 3 of us that worked from the very beginning to the end of our dissertation process. 2 things here. One is I am perfectionistic, and I am until this day, and I really worried that I would never finish. And so, you know, if I worked with these 2 other students, maybe they'd hold me accountable and tell me to stop, you know, my nonsense of trying to make things perfect. But also gave me a forum for talking about what I was interested in. So I quickly shifted from spirituality at work to collaboration. And then took it a little deeper and said, I'm really interested in studying high-end collaboration. And then what occurred is I'm working with these 2 women, fellow students, and we 3 decided, what if we studied our own experience of high-end collaboration? So that's where it went into the collaboration literature. For those who are interested, I'm going to post the book chapter of my experience of working with these other students. And if you're interested in creating a partnership with others, it might be of interest to you. So it was move into high-end collaboration.
That's great. So my topic, again, alternate work arrangements on work and family outcomes. And when I explored the literature, which will be what we'll talk about next, the scholar's dilemma I had was that there was just a saturation of research. And so at that point, I had to make a decision on whether I continued on this path of additional discovery or do I switch to another topic. At the time, I felt I didn't need to do that. And I really wanted to explore the literature in much more depth, especially since the literature were giving conflicting findings in regards to what are the true outcomes of having flexible work arrangements. And so that's how I decided to do a meta-analysis to come up with a definitive answer on whether flex time and telecommuting actually work for employees And that was my road and my path to my dissertation. So so since I've already alluded to the literature review, talk to me about your literature review. What did that entail? What gaps you discovered, and consequently how that led you into the purpose for your study?
I can start. And so what happened is I'm interested in high-end collaboration, and we three decided that we were going to study our own experience of high-end collaboration and use that as the data for our dissertations. We had been taping our meetings from the get-go. We met um, we met in person every quarter, even though we were in different parts of the country. We met every Sunday, recorded those, had all of our emails, we collected all that data. And somewhere, this is where, you know, accident or grace or whatever you want to call it comes into play, that someone sent me a booklet that David Bohm wrote on dialogue. And it was a big aha for me because I read it and said, he's talking about what I've been experiencing with these two colleagues. At that time, David Bohm's theory of dialogue was dominant in the business world. And there were things that's what was most popular. I didn't particularly like it. So I went into the literature to find other theories of dialogue, from Socrates, right, starting way back then with his dialogic inquiry, to Jean Baker Miller, you know, more currently in kind of feminist research. And so dialogue was the large area, but what I did was I zeroed in on the work of Martin Buber, Carl Rogers, and Paulo Freire. So you might see each of those as a circle. And what I did in my literature review was present their theories of dialogue and critique them. So now I've gone from spirituality at work once upon a time, now down to something very specific, relational theories of dialogue.
Great.
And for myself, you know, I just did a lot of reading. What started to impact me and drive my reading into the literature was commercials and advertisements. I was trying to understand why things like infomercials would work and why newscasters would phrase stories in certain ways. And I read probably 200 different articles about the topic of the way that we interpret information and what we do with that. And that really opened a door for me to walk through, which was this idea of inflammatory language, of how that can change the way that we process information, how we interpret the things that are coming into us cognitively. And that process, I would say, opposite to what Martin was going through, was much more independent. It was much more sort of following the trail of evidence, so to speak. I relate a lot of things to this idea of like a mystery that I'm trying to solve, or at least explore more about. And so I was very open to what I was receiving. I didn't have an idea of what I thought it was, but I did have my own experiences to reference, my own reactions to what I was seeing on TV, what made me feel good, what didn't, and different situations in which I was maybe reacting in different ways.
That was great. I think I had the same experience, that level of excitement, that level of discovery when you're digging into your literature and you're finding all these great articles and you're seeing their findings, and you get really excited yourself because you see the end product of what your dissertation could look like. And I think I had certainly the same discovery, although I was really overwhelmed with the literature, mainly because there was so much literature on alternative work arrangements. I think at one point I was close to 2,000 articles, and mine is not a good example in terms of how many articles you should collect, but I really truly wanted to do an exhaustive study of the literature, especially since I was doing a meta-analysis, and I need to parse out the articles that I would use as secondary analysis. So that was my literature experience, but it really made me appreciate how much good research was already out there that I could then take and use
Yeah.
for my study.
Yeah.
So Dr. Leahy, talk to us about your purpose in regards to what you wanted to study, experience, process, and also, interestingly, working with two other dissertation students. How did you find that balance between those other two members?
You know, what we each of us, so if you think about high-end collaboration being the foundation, or really, let's set this theory aside, wanting to study our own experience is what each of us were really interested in, to say it in plain English. And so each of us took a different angle. So I studied it from the perspective of dialogue. One colleague studied it from the perspective of learning. Another reflective learning. Another colleague studied it from the perspective of both and, like moving beyond either or to both and. And we produced three completely separate dissertations, different literature reviews, et cetera. But the major objective for my study was I started looking at methodologies, and I found one called heuristic research, where it's a combination of phenomenology and hermeneutics and personal experience. So in heuristic research, the researcher must have had the experience that they are studying. It's phenomenological because it's interested in studying an experience, and hermeneutic because it's about interpreting that experience. So the thing to be studied in my case was the experience of dialogue, and the research strategy, the high level strategy, was heuristic research, which is the methodology that brings these three things together. That research methodology, I should say, has another distinction, and that is that you're interested not only in the phenomenon and interpreting it, but in the human beings who are involved. And so part of the report is making these human beings come alive.
Interesting. What about you, Dr. Schwab?
Come back to me. I want to hear what you say, Marlon.
Sure. Well, my overarching purpose was really to come up with a definitive answer. I really wanted that final answer on whether alternative work arrangements help or hurt us, either in terms of our productivity and other types of work outcomes. I really wanted to know the final answer. And then in terms of our lives, in terms of quality of life, family work conflict, different aspects of family, I really wanted to know what that answer was. And so that was a driving factor for me. That was my strategy. And in terms of my hypotheses, that's how those were developed, to be able to find that answer that someone could definitely say at that point, these were the outcomes of flex time and telework.
Yeah.
And so that really was my purpose.
I mean, I think for me, I just wanted to see what would happen. I mean, part of my research design was just presenting people with different kinds of messages, like just read this, tell me how you feel about it, and write down what you remember. I didn't know what to expect. I definitely had hypotheses and what I thought might happen. But I wasn't sure exactly what would happen. I guess the purpose of my study was just to fill in that gap for me of what's going to happen with this? What is this? And sort of exploring that.
Yeah, exactly. So that driving purpose leads us into our overarching research question, which is what we go over in quite a bit of detail in the research methods courses. And Martin, you've listed, basically what those research questions should try to answer based on some keywords here. I think for me, mine was definitely trying to, because mine was a mixed methods meta-analysis, it really helped to answer or explain what was going on with the secondary data as well as really try to discover what the end result was in regards to my secondary analysis. So those are the two basic research questions that I had for my meta-analysis. Anyone else in regards to your research question?
I was really just looking for relationships. I wanted to explore that and to understand how a few things connected, what we read, our emotions, and what we did with that information.
And I was interested in just exploring and describing. None of these other verbs really applied. My research question was, what's the experience of dialogue? So I wanted to explore that and describe it. It was not a part of my question at the beginning of the study, but at the end of the study, Emancipate was really ultimately became something that emerged from the findings, and how this experience of dialogue freed us as a group and as individuals and supported our own growth. But I didn't go into it with that in mind.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so from that standpoint, then we get into the logistics of the research, and something I encourage my students to really think about early and think about often, because things can happen where logistically you can't conduct your study, or things may be hard to do, such as data collection or finding an instrument or picking a proper methodology based on where you'd like to collect data and how you'd like to collect data. There are just so many different moving pieces here. So this is my favorite part of my dissertation, really digging into the different aspects of the methodology of doing a meta-analysis, which again made it very exciting for me to go through that piece and go through the process. So I'll turn it over to my colleagues here. Anyone want to talk about your general methodology, how you thought about the logistics of it, and how you were able to get it done?
Sure, I can go because I have a feeling Martin's is more complicated than mine. I did a quantitative study with an open-ended question. So I did collect a little bit of qualitative data, but I was looking for really an on-off switch. I heard about an instrument from one of my colleagues in my cohort, and that really helped me. It sort of set things in motion. It was called the PANAS, and it measures where you are in a very simplistic way emotionally. And once I figured out that I wanted to do something with an intervention, I wanted to see if I could move people, I knew that I could do a pre and post test, and then in the middle, I could sort of play. And what I did was I came up with different kinds of messages to present participants with to see if I could move their affect in any sort of way, up or down. And I compiled these messages by looking at different websites and blogs. I didn't write them, but I compiled them in a way that I knew would have a certain effect. And then to conclude the study, after moving their emotions, I asked them to just tell me, what do you remember about what you just read? I was trying to capitalize on a variable called elaboration to try to get them to really think about what I had presented them with. And of course, participants did weird things with that because humans are never predictable. But I did get my research question answered, and I did it in a quantitative way for the most part. And I collected my data very, very quickly. I was able to secure the responses that I needed within a day.
Wow, that is fast.
Yeah.
Dr. Leahy?
What I did is I already had data, right? I had too much. And in fact, decided that the primary data would be transcripts of live conversations we had, and emails and other artifacts would supplement that. I already had participants. There were no interviews to be done. I already had the information. In terms of storing and displaying the data and analyzing it, this was 20 years ago. And there was qualitative data analysis software. And to tell you the truth, I don't remember. Oh yeah, Nudist in those days is what it was called. And I tried to use that, QSR Nudist. But what I ultimately did was in my office, I dedicated a whole wall to data. I was literally immersed in my data with hundreds of Post-its on the wall. And I kept moving the Post-its around. clustering them in different ways, and then color-coded them and put numbers and other kinds of things on them. But it felt great to be immersed, literally immersed in the data. So that's how I did data analysis and how I reached conclusions. Now, for all of this method, all of these like nuts and bolts kinds of things like collection, analysis, trustworthiness, etc., I went back to heuristic research and said, what's the way that I'm supposed to do it? If I'm going to claim this is a heuristic research study, I need to follow a theory for collecting, analyzing data, etc., and not something that I just make up. So I think that's something I really emphasize with students. You're not, at this point for most students, they're not following Creswell, but if they're doing a narrative study, well, how do Clendenin and Conley, for example, suggest you do these things? So you're justifying your nuts and bolts by situating it within a respected overall strategy.
That's great. Yeah, so mine was a little bit complicated. I don't know how much detail I should go into, but I'll keep it brief. Basically, I had to reanalyze data that was already collected. So there is a methodology for that using software. It's called comprehensive meta-analysis software, which basically allows you to plug in the findings based on the previous research into the software, and it basically reanalyzes it for you and gives you a final outcome, which is pretty cool software. I just needed to educate myself on that. The other piece of education that I need to help prepare myself for is the discovery of qualitative. And I truly mean the discovery of qualitative because I really had no clue about qualitative. And so that's why I really fell in love with qualitative, really discovering Strauss and Corbin and Glaser's work and Sharmaz's work, and reading about ethnography, reading about the different types of phenomenology, and really understanding that while I was seeing these come up in the articles. As I said, I was doing a qualitative research synthesis as well. So that was the other piece. And that's also where I learned to use NVivo, which actually stemmed from Nudis, same company, QSR International, and learned how to use that. But similar to you, Martin, I had to basically immerse myself in the data, and I truly did that. It's similar to the way you posted everything on your wall and move things around and look for general themes. I did the same exact thing. I also had a second coder to help me. So this was another graduate student that was a really good friend, and she helped with ensuring that, you know, I wasn't biasing anything by coding herself. And so we were able to look at agreements in terms of coding. So it really was a complicated process, but in the end, I ended up getting through the core articles that I used as secondary data to come up with a definitive answer to my study.
How many articles?
I actually ended up, out of the 2,000, whittled them down to 44 articles, so 44 key articles that I ended up using. Yeah, and that's the process. You start with, you know, a really broad brush of all the literature that's out there, and you whittle them down to this set number that you would use as a final meta-analysis. And now I understand why you need a team of people doing a meta-analysis. I wish I had realized that when I first started. Nonetheless, it taught me quite a bit.
You're saying whittle down, but if I don't really know meta-analysis well, but if I understand, I've listened to you describe your work before, Marlon. So that was 44 data sets?
44 data sets, yeah.
Holy God. I mean,
yeah, it's a lot of data.
Hardly whittled down.
It's a lot of data, yeah.
Yeah. Wow. And I did member checking, by the way. I went back to the two folks that I've been working with for, at that point, 2.5 years, and had them read what I wrote and made revisions based on what they said.
Okay, and I used Rater Agreement. I created a Rater guide, basically, of what I was looking for and taught them. I used 2 of my colleagues from my cohort, and they helped me look through and see if I was seeing the same thing that they were as well. And we did an inter-Rater reliability.
Great. It's interesting how we all used our colleagues in some sense. I think that's something that can be learned here, that the dissertation process does not need to be a lonely one.
No.
especially if you have colleagues that could help you in regards to member checking or doing secondary coding, or in your case, Martin, where you had 2 other dissertation members.
Yeah, and I helped a couple students with, one of them was modifying an assessment, so I helped them with item rating, which I'm kind of good at, and another with something similar, and walked someone through their analysis as well. It was a partnership. I don't think that I came up with the topic in partnership, but when it came down to maybe the more nuts and bolts of actually doing the research, that was when I really found helping my colleagues and them helping me was really helpful.
And something that Dr. Schwab said when we were talking about purpose that I wanted to underscore was, you said something like you had a feeling for what might be going on. Would you translate it into hypotheses? For those of you who are doing qualitative research, you do have a hunch as to what's going on. It's not a hypothesis in the formal sense, but if you didn't have a hunch, you couldn't do the study.
Right.
Because your hunch is there are these variables or these concepts, and my hunch is this is the relationship between them.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of students are fearful of that because they think they're predetermining or being biased. Not at all, because you hold it lightly. But if you didn't have that, you'd be wandering around the world,
Right.
not knowing where you're going.
Right.
So this was a good conversation, Dr. Leahy. The iterative piece, we can talk about as next parts of it, but that's something to stress in regards to your double arrows there at the top of the 2 frames there, because that's really important when we think about our dissertation, is really how it is a cycle and not just sequential. So I'll turn it over to you and we could engage in a discussion there.
Yeah, I think students can save themselves. Somebody this week posted in class, it's going to take a lot more time than I think, and more money, and the study is not going to submit itself to my plan on an Excel spreadsheet. And I loved it because it's not a straight line. You'll save yourself heartache if you know that, this process, it's going forward and then it's going back. So this is what I think we don't know. I go to the literature, I find out, well, we already know that, but we don't know this. And so I go back and refine the research problem. It's cycling forward and cycling back many times. And it never ceases to surprise me that in a proposal defense, students, this is for qualitative studies, I don't know if this would work for quantitative, but students will tweak their research question, maybe with 1 word, and it finally all comes together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say I was still working my research question, refining it through my proposal defense until we came to an agreement at the end of that defense that this is what it was, and that was how I was proceeding. But it continued to evolve throughout the discussions that I was having, throughout the literature I was reading, and thinking through what would work from a methodological standpoint as well. Marlon, did yours change too?
No, mine was pretty clear cut because
Okay.
with a meta-analysis, you don't have much wiggle room really, because you kind of know based on what's been dictated before. And that's the issue with secondary research. It's sort of you use what the data gives you. And so it's a little bit different. And so I think that's a good suggestion for those that are thinking about using secondary data or archival data, that you sort of work backwards, where you have the data and from there you develop the research questions based on that data, and then sort of get into a deeper literature review at that point.
I'm smiling when Liz said, Marlon, did yours change? At my dissertation defense, or no, 3 days before my dissertation defense, a member of my committee said, I really know the literature you should situate this study in. At that time, it had been 2.5 years. And I said, thank you very much. That's something I'll consider for the future. There was no way she was going to impose her theoretical interests on me. And it had iterated enough. It was done. It was done. At that point, I just said, it's done. And I don't care what you say, I am not going back to it.
Good for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was, a couple days before. The other point is the process is recursive. And I should study this word in both math and linguistics, but it has something to do with not just repeating the same rules, but when you change an element, it changes all the other elements, or could change all the other elements of the design. So you need to loop back to see if you need to change anything. So for example, if I decide I'm going to situate it in these three literatures, that will, and that's something I hadn't seen in advance, that will certainly change the gap in the literature that I'm addressing, right? It might even make the practical problem more precise than I'd originally presented it. I think, what I would say here, and Dr. Schwab and Dr. Sakal, I'm interested in your thoughts. What I'd say here is, this is a whole. They all fit together. I am stunned when a student sends me a proposal and they've revised the purpose of their study. They're gonna evaluate. They're not gonna describe. But they never go back to change the problem. Like, that changes everything. Have you all encountered that? This is it. They need to fit together. I mean, it's a whole. Integrity is important, right?
Yeah, it's that alignment we stress all the time. So everything needs to be interconnected. And again, if you change anything in your research question, if you change anything in your methodology, then you do need to go back and change things in your research problem and your purpose. So I see it all the time, especially with methodology, when they get to that point, if they can't find an instrument perhaps, or they can't collect data at a particular site, or issues of data analysis even, they will need to adjust accordingly. So it happens. And again, that's why you need to be open and flexible and iterative in your process.
Yeah, and I think people get blind to reading their material over and over again. So it can be helpful to give it to a friend to read and say, does this make sense in terms of harmonization? They may not understand everything, but they will understand if you start talking about one thing in the beginning of your proposal and something completely different at the end, and making sure that everything has a very clear logical line.
So this is good conversation.
Yes, this is great.
Do we have anything we want to say so that it's complete?
Stay flexible. I think that students fall in love with their research, which why wouldn't you? It's something that's inspiring and energizing to you. But don't be so tied to it that when others make suggestions or refinements, that you can't move with it. Stay flexible.
I would certainly agree with that. And the other piece is, start to think about or making that transition from your practical problem to your research problem. To me, that's a wake-up call for students, and going through a PhD graduate level program, because that's the paradigm shift where we're going on this journey to make you into scholars, or to help at least your understanding of scholarly work and scholarly research. And so taking that, as I mentioned earlier, taking that practical hat off and putting on the scholarly cap, and really digging into the literature and really discovering the gap that we talked about in the literature is really one of the first steps. So again, that paradigm shift is so important.
And speaking about paradigms, when I hear students say, what are you working on? I'll say to them, well, I'm writing my literature review. And it sounds like they're writing a paper. Or that's what I'm suspicious about. And the paradigm, the frame is designing and carrying out a piece of research. So it's not, I'm doing a literature review because my chair says I need to have one or the school requires it. It's like, I can't go out and do the study without knowing what we already know.
Mm-hmm.
It's thinking like a researcher. And please, whenever you're around me, don't refer to your dissertation as a paper. And faculty do it, and it drives me crazy.
Mm-hmm.
It drives me nuts. So that's just me. But you're doing research. It's like, you know, the guy chopping rocks and, you know, in a quarry, what are you doing? He says, I'm building a cathedral. You know, everybody has a frame for what they're doing. So that would be the one that I really encourage you to put on the researcher's mantle and think from there, not from a student in a course, because this is a very different process.
Well, thank you both. This has been a good conversation.
And thanks to both of you, I learned a few things.
So did I. Marlon, your research.
Really?
By the way, that's an outlier type of research, not the norm. So this is, do not use me as an example, please.
And mine was an outlier also, because it was working together for a couple of years with 3 other people. That was my choice. And most of you will not put that much time into collecting data. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.